One of the most popular domains of photography where the Fujifilm X100 line of cameras really shine is street photography. Because the tiny form factor and the compact nature of these cameras is what makes them ideal candidates for street photography. And let's face it, as an introvert, it's very important for me to avoid any confrontations and be as inconspicuous as possible and just be out there shooting like a ninja. In this video, I'm going to show you my street photography settings on my Fujifilm X100VI camera. But if you own a Fujifilm X100V, these settings should also apply to you for the most part. Let's jump right into it. One of the first settings that I want to start with is your shooting mode. For me, when I'm out shooting in the street, I like to be in aperture priority because I want to be in charge of the aperture so that I get to call the shots on how much area I want to cover, what are the elements that should be in focus, what are the elements that should be out of focus, or what your depth of field should be. So in order to set your camera to aperture priority, the first thing that you need to do is you need to rotate the aperture ring and set it to A, and you need to also change your shutter speed and ISO to A as well, which is automatic. And then what I've done is I have programmed my rear command dial to be able to adjust the aperture value so that I can just rotate this guy here and then set the aperture accordingly. So once you start setting the aperture value, it goes into aperture priority mode, and how you can tell that, it's going to show you A on your display, which means the camera is now in aperture priority mode. Now the two variables that I touched upon over here is your shutter speed and ISO that I set to automatic are the two variables that you can also have some control over, and that's what I'm going to show you now. So the two variables that I just spoke about, your ISO and your shutter speed that we just set to auto, are also two things that you can have little control over, and that's what I'm going to touch upon in this one. So by setting this to auto here, there is a setting in your camera that lets you choose 3 auto ISO settings, and all those 3 ISO settings also have a minimum shutter speed that you can dial in. So by doing that, you are asking the camera to be in charge of the ISO and shutter speed, but also you are defining the limits that it has to be in. One catch about this method though is you can have a minimum shutter speed of X, and then if the camera determines that using that minimum shutter speed and the ISO range, it's not able to determine the optimal exposure, it can override that shutter speed and use a lower shutter speed. So that could result in blurry photos. So that is something to be mindful of. But if you are in a place where you have abundant natural light, or you have a decent amount of light coming from a light source, you should be fine. But if the camera is able to figure out that it won't be able to get the exposure correct, then it can override that shutter speed. So that's just something to be careful about. So to access auto ISO setting and to set it up, what you need to do is you need to go on the third main menu here, which is your shooting setting. And in the deep menus, you have to go on the third page, and the first item will be auto ISO setting. Now on the X100V, it might be on page 2 of this menu, so you'll have to check it for yourself. But since I'm using an X100VI, that's where it is for me. So what I've done here is I've set 3 ISO auto settings. The first one is auto 1, which is my general street photography setting in daylight. So when it's plenty bright outside, I use this setting. The default is 125, which is the minimum, and the maximum that I want it to go up to is 800. And I'm also keeping the minimum shutter speed to be 1/250. I feel like this gives me a good amount of range when I'm out shooting in the street in daytime, and I can also get crispy shots while freezing the motion by using the minimum shutter speed of 1/250. Now it can go over 1/250 if it's able to use a lower ISO, but the minimum is what I'm setting here. But like I said, if it's not able to determine the exposure correctly, it can use a lower shutter speed. The second one is Auto 2, which also uses the same minimum default sensitivity of 125, but my maximum I have cranked it up to 3200. This is for overcast days when it's not so bright outside, but I still want to be able to get the shot. And again, minimum shutter speed here I've set to 1/250. The last one, Auto 3, is for those scenarios where I don't want to miss the shot and I would rather get a grainy image and then spend some time in post to correct it later instead of missing the shot. So what I've done here is maximum sensitivity is all the way to 12,800 and minimum shutter speed is 1/500. So the reason that I have doubled the minimum shutter speed in this one is to really capture the motion even if the light is not so cooperating outside. So after you set your auto ISO, what I have done here is I have assigned it to this shortcut here. And I talk about this in a previous video. I'll link that video down here so you can check it out. So what I've done with auto ISO is if I flick this to the right and hold it for a second, it's going to bring auto ISO setting for me. So what that does is it's really one sort of flick away for me, and I can have those auto ISO in front of me and easily access the settings. The third setting is again another setting that I've assigned to a custom button, and that's this button right here. You can press this, and I also talked about this in the same video that I'm going to link below. Basically what I've assigned to this setting is face detection on and off. So by doing this, I can choose if I don't want this to capture a face in the street that I don't want to photograph. So you might be in a crowded situation and you want to photograph somebody on the street, but the camera thinks someone else is more interesting and the camera is going to pick up on their face. So you can turn this off and you can have more control over what you want to focus on. So here I just wanted to give you a quick demo and look what happens when I turn face detect off. It stops detecting the face here, and I can then focus on something else and recompose. And if I want it to capture the face again, then I can turn that back on, and now it's catching on to the face. So this is something that can be really handy when you're out in the street and you just want to snap something and you don't want the camera to pick a face that you don't want to shoot. The next one is your image quality. So for me, 99% of the times I'm shooting in RAW, but if I am in a situation where I'm just taking a lot of photos, what I would do is I would switch it to normal plus RAW, and what that does is the JPEG images that are stored in the memory card, I use them as thumbnails so that I can quickly take a peek on the same RAW file, how it's going to look like or what did I actually capture there. And then I can use the RAW file that I like from that group and edit that later. So it makes the culling process easier for me. And the two reasons I want to shoot in RAW is, the first one is obviously the amazing film recipes that you can program in your camera. Now you don't have to settle with just the 7 recipes that you can store in your camera. You can have unlimited amount of recipes at your disposal, which I covered in another video that I'm going to link in this video below. The second reason that I shoot RAW is so that if I have to make finer adjustments later, like I want to take someone out of the frame or remove an unwanted element, I can then put that RAW file in Lightroom and then just remove that person or the unwanted element from the photo. So that's what makes it easier for me. The next setting that is really important for street photography especially, or if you're shooting an event where you don't want to be noticed and you just want to be silently standing in a corner shooting away, is your shutter sound. So these cameras have leaf shutter, which is very silent in itself, but to avoid getting noticed, what I've done here is I've gone into the sound setup, which you can find on this wrench icon on your main menu, which is the setup, and go on to the second one, the sound setup here, and then find the shutter volume. So if you use both mechanical and electronic shutter, you can customize the volume and turn it completely off, which is going to make this camera so silent that even you won't hear a sound if you're shooting someone. So that could have a disadvantage as well, because if you are out shooting and you click the shutter button, there's no indication that you have taken the picture. So I sometimes find myself in situations that I click the button and I'm not sure if I've taken the shot, and I have to go and actually make sure that I did take it. The next setting is your autofocus. So what you want to do when you're using this camera is to make sure that you are using the right autofocus settings for scenarios that require that kind of autofocus. For example, on the street, you probably want to shoot in continuous autofocus mode unless you are a typical manual focus shooter. And no offense to that I have used manual focus before. It just works out for me sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. So if it works out for you, go with that. For me personally, when I'm shooting in the street, I find continuous autofocus mode as the way to go. And what I've done here is I've gone into the AF/MF setting here and I've set the autofocus mode to all, which gives me a way to use every single autofocus mode available here. And then what I've done is I have set this to continuous autofocus mode, which you can do so by choosing the C option here, which is continuous instead of single. Now, if you are in a situation where your subject is stationary, then you might want to do single, but streets are always in motion, so continuous is what works out for me. And on top of that, what I have done is I have decoupled the autofocus from my shutter button here, and I have assigned the back button as the focus button for my camera. So what this does is it allows me to do back button focusing, and since this rear command dial sits right where my thumb is, it's very easy for me to just press this button and acquire focus instead of half pressing and relying on this, because sometimes you may press it a little too hard or you may press it not so hard.
That's what she said.
And that just makes it difficult to figure out whether you've actually acquired focus or not. So I just remove that from here and I use this button instead. So it's very easy for me when I'm holding the camera like that and my thumb is right where this button is, and I can then take the photo. Now this one is an optional configuration, but what I've done is I've set this front command dial to change the exposure value. So what this does is by rotating this front dial, it lets me make finer adjustments to the exposure, and that gives me more creative control on my shot, and that makes it easier for me to compose and get the exposure right. So what you have to do is you have to go in your settings and you have to go on this wrench menu, which is the setup, and then go to button dial setting, and over here you have to find the command dial setting and just set the front dial to exposure compensation. Now you will see that I have set this to shutter speed as well and ISO as well. This is for when I'm shooting manually and I want to make those finer adjustments and have control over every single variable. But these settings are for another video. Since we are talking about aperture priority, these have nothing to do with that. And I just want you to focus on the exposure compensation because that's what I'm talking about in this one. These two things that I'm going to talk about are optional. The first thing is I would recommend you get a skin if your camera color is silver. I know you may really like the silver color, I certainly do, but the reason that I've put the skin on and I've used a darker color here is so that it really makes the camera inconspicuous when you're out there, because I feel like if it's silver, it's a little too shiny and it might grab someone's attention, but that's completely optional. But if you feel like it's not going to be a problem for you, you can feel free to go ahead and shoot in your silver camera. Now, I do have the silver hood here, but I can just have the filter ring and the filter applied and I won't have the hood here. So again, optional. If you feel like, go for it. If you don't feel like it, you can avoid this. The second one is this wrist cuff. So what I've done is I just put this over here and I put it on my wrist. If I'm holding it for a whole day and I'm out walking in the street and somebody tries to snatch my camera away, which is one of my worst fears, I still have this so that if the camera goes, I go with them. So that's it guys, this is how I have configured the settings on my Fujifilm X100VI for street photography. If you found this video useful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel. Your support really keeps me going and inspires me to make more videos like this. I'm going to put some photos that I took from this camera out in the street. So grab your favorite beverage, sit back, relax and enjoy. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.